Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hello there, all back again after
I
last
noticed there's
week.
one dog collar visible.
Yeah.
Looking lovely, Deb.
Thank you. This is my homemade dog collar as I've run out of the real thing.
Is that off a fairly liquid bottle or so? There are other,
Well-
by the way, there are other washing up liquids available. Just so
If
you
it
know.
was in the days, if it could have been washing up liquid bottle, it would have been better. But this is cardboard, and when you're close up, you can see all the crinkles in it, and I've been
Can we
pulled up
see
about it.
Can we see the Kellogg's logo on the other side? You haven't taken off or something.
I might have to find a new one before Sunday.
I have got plenty of them. I can let you have them. Believe me.
Oh, have you? Well, I would love one.
Yeah, I'll put it in the post if it gets
Thank
to
you.
first class. Hello.
Oh, thanks, David.
I can give you one later today, Deb, if you like.
It's probably a safer bet for Sunday than me posting it. I tell you.
I was just saying to Chris earlier that when Helen was here, who is our curate, just to remind anyone who's watching, she always used to turn up and she'd forgotten her dog collar, and I had to cut a lot in half. I felt like, it was like a gospel moment, sharing, and I cut but they got smaller and smaller, and so I'm blaming Helen because she's not here. So.
Well, there we are. Yeah, I see a lovely picture of her baby. That's very good.
Yeah.
Very good,
I think her little daughter's being baptised this weekend, I think.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
We failed in our going on road last week.
Well, Chris,
Our outside broadcast.
I was just about to raise that because last week, dear viewer, you may remember that we weren't certain what was going to happen because it was that day in the year again of the annual Melplash show. And last year, those of us who were at the show on the tent tried miserably, really, due to lack of skill on my behalf, to send a video out as a kind of fill-in for RevChat, which didn't really work. But Chris, you sound like you had the same difficulty.
Yeah, my camera skills. We did record something, and what a shame, because I had a guest speaker in John Rees.
Oh, well.
About bread again. But our heads were in and out all the corners of the screen, and the screen was crooked, and the wind was blowing, and it just wasn't transmittable.
You see, what some of you will not know, because you weren't involved in RevChat in certain days, the very early ones that Joe and I did were recorded, obviously live, but they were recorded on all over the place. So it was a picture of us stood in the church, with the camera in front of us on Joe's camera stand, and then during COVID, we sat at a safe distance at various benches in Vicarage Gardens with tractors racing past and the wind blowing and all kinds of stuff in those early days. So we have done outside broadcast before, Chris, but it does remind me very much of those kind of 1930s old BBC films that you see occasionally.
It was super windy on Melplash Day anyway this year. So you'd have probably got loads of wind noise.
And I did see,
unlike the normal RevChat.
I did see a picture on Facebook, Callie, of you meeting royalty at the show. Mr. Wakely. I thought he was the Prince of Wales or something. He looked very smart, didn't he? I have told him this already, so you're okay. Yeah.
So there were people dressed so smartly.
Yeah, and then you lot.
And then us lot, exactly. But it was very impressive, very impressive. I was just bowled over by how amazing that show was. How go to that effort, such huge effort for one day. I could have happily had 3 days of Melplash show and still not seen everything.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the best one-day shows. There are a number around Dorset. Shaftesbury and Gillingham is one, which springs to mind. I'm told is fairly good, and there's some of the smaller places have them. But having been chaplain of the Shropshire and West Mid show, which is a 4-day show, I am impressed, and the same amount of effort, it seems, goes into setting up for one day as setting up for 4 days.
It seemed so big and yet still so wonderfully local. All the best of being big and all the best of being local. It was lovely.
Oh, yeah, that was your tagline the other day.
Yes, large and local.
Large and local. I think that they ought to use that next year. The Melplush show. We're large, we're local.
Yeah, I still remember we must have been the year before last, wasn't last year? It was the year before last. We celebrated the 150th anniversary, I think it was, of the founding of the show, which happened at the pub and the field behind the church in Melplash all those years ago, with a bet, basically, a drunken bet. So the story goes. But I asked for some information from the president regarding the show's history so I could talk about it in the address. And he sent me some lovely bits and pieces, about how jam making was only admitted into the show in 1924, or those kind of things. But there was one which I kept to the very end, and they introduced in 1890 something. They introduced 3 new classes to the show itinerary that you could win prizes for. One of them was for the person who'd worked the longest in one place on a farm. And a lady who'd been there for something like 78 years won the prize. Now, you'd think she'd win it next year, wouldn't you? But of course, she was disqualified the next year because you couldn't keep giving it to the same person. And then the second new class was the person who entered the biggest in hand size cart horse, the best turned out, largest cart horse. And that was great. The final one, which I kept to the end and used quite regularly now, was that they invented a new prize for the man who'd sired the most children without going to the poor fund in Bridport.
Oh my God. How many children does history relate?
18, I think it was, for that particular man. But the point was, you could sire as many as you like, but if you went to the poor fund, you couldn't. You weren't included in the competition. Yeah.
I think that says a lot about our world, that
About
the
Bridport.
man gets the award. The woman who bore all the children, or the women who bore all the children, they just don't even get mentioned.
I think it was one lady. I think it was one. However, yes, it does. It also says a lot about Bridport. And there we are. We'll say no more on that. We've got a reading, I understand, from Mark's Gospel today, haven't we, Chris? cutting his cloth while he was going to
Quickly, quietly segue from that last one into a pause.
There we are.
We pause.
Yes, a reading from Mark's Gospel from chapter 7. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines.' You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition." Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person.
So there you go. You don't go to heaven if you don't wash your feet and your hands before you eat.
Or do
I
you?
thought it was a regular practice, even in those days, to wash your hands before you ate.
I bet they did wash their hands, but they didn't do it in a certain way.
Oh, that's the clue. See, Debs, you're quite right.
I mean, yeah.
It's all about preparation, isn't it?
You think they knew more like scientific washing? I remember when I went to a hospital chaplaincy training course at the start of COVID. They spent 20 minutes teaching you how to wash your hands.
Quite right. Well,
And
they do that with the primary school children, don't they? In their when they first go to school, they show them how to wash their hands properly and all that stuff, which is a sad indictment on society that you don't know how to wash your hands when you get to school. But there we are. And there are, of course, special ways. I remember when I was a student nurse working in operating theatres, the first day you're taught how to scrub your hands properly and how to, start at the elbow down and all this kind of stuff, fingers and hands. And I find myself still using the technique when COVID came in and we were squirting all that gel on our hands, scrubbing your fingers. And
Yeah.
so, yes, you're quite right. It's about how you do it and is it done properly or are you defiled? But we've had a lot about food, haven't we, Debs? We keep on talking Jesus and bread.
We do. We do keep on talking about Jesus and food. I think he's. Well, I was reminded. I didn't get to Greenbelt this year, sadly, for the second year in a row. But because Greenbelt was happening at the same time as the Mel Plus show, where you were all very busy. But John Bell from the Iona community is always there. And I do remember quite some years ago being very bowled over by a talk he did. And the title got people to go because you always think of Jesus as quite an emaciated figure. And the title of his talk was Jesus Was a Fat Man. And I think, I can't remember the ins and outs of it, but I think he was talking about generosity and abundance and, a sort of larger than life sort of life force. And so Jesus Was a Fat Man is quite a good this could be the season of Jesus Was a Fat Man because we've been talking about Jesus and food and eating with others for a long, long time now. And now we're getting to the preparation for eating. And I think there's a lot in there, which is, it's a really great reading because it's about the difference between the outer and the inner, I think, quite a lot of it.
I was reading early in the week when I was starting to think and prepare for Sunday with this reading. I was looking at one of Tom Wright's commentaries. And what he was saying or suggesting was that Mark is trying to say that what Jesus says to the disciples, he may not necessarily be able to say to the rest of the crowds, and that's the kind of thrust of the reading, and go on from there.
So that's interesting because there are different bits to the reading, aren't there? Because it's different bits of that chapter stitched together. So the last bit of the reading is where he calls the crowd and talks to the crowd about the sins that defile. But the earlier bit, that's interesting. So Tom Wright saying that the earlier bit was just the disciples.
Possibly. That's what Mark is suggesting. He says he's not particularly suggesting. He says Mark is suggesting that.
But that one verse, I think, stands out. You neglect the commandment of God in order to maintain the tradition of men, and I think that's quite telling in all of that because when they were criticizing Jesus' disciples for not washing sufficiently, or maybe they didn't wash, but I'm not sure that that's true. It's all about being seen to do the right thing, and what's in your heart. The reading talks about, what you put into your body isn't what defiles it, it's what comes out. And so, yeah.
I think that refers to more than just the food angle, doesn't it? Our lives, what we do. We may say all the right words to be seen, but if our actions don't match the words, then that's what is wrong, or in the words you used, defiling us, because we're not doing what God would expect or require of us. That is to give love and to show care. And
I think we've also got a little bit of a, and this is where life gets a little more complicated, is if you're around people that are using bad language or eating inappropriate food or doing inappropriate things, over a period of time, that can rub off and make you want to be a little bit like that. But then if you always stay away from people and only stay holy and pure and never actually expose yourselves, you're never actually out there living the gospel and letting your goodness rub off on others. So the bit about letting what other people eat and do and their misbehaviours not rub off on you, our misbehaviours must be the good ones that rub off on them. And that's a very hard balance to get, I think, because it's easy to want to be out and about too much or so much that we become like people. I mean, I think the easiest example is, I've met somebody who was in a workplace where swearing was absolutely prevalent all day, every day. And after working there for a year, this person was swearing just as much when they started working there, they weren't.
That reminds me of seeing my godson has gone into the Marines, and every now and again I see him in passing because he's the same age as my son, and he has to modify his language around me because he's just used to, swearing and cussing the whole time, and he forgets, and it doesn't bother me particularly, but it always bothers him. He goes, "Oh, sorry. Really sorry."
How many times a day do you go, "Oh, sorry, Vicar. Sorry, Vicar. Didn't mean to swear. Mustn't swear. Vicar's here. Vicar's here."
It's very funny.
It's very interesting because when they were drawing up the do's and don'ts for the workers who are finishing off the toilet and kitchen project now in Beaminster, only a week or so to go, written into the what they couldn't do, was they weren't allowed to play radios in church. Apparently, the architect wrote in. They weren't allowed to have their phones for personal use on because it stops them working. But one other thing he wrote into the contract is that they must not swear whilst in the church.
Who wrote that up?
Daniel Cantrell, the architect.
What, he said they couldn't listen to the radio in church?
No.
Gosh, he sounds... Oh, not him personally, but that does sound very much like this reading. I mean, the Pharisees use power over other people, I think, massively,
Well, apparently it's written into a lot of contracts now because, even if people are working on the road, radios blaring can be seen as a nuisance thing. I don't think the radio is specifically just for the church, but you're right. Yeah, but it did make me smile when I saw this list of do's and don'ts that the workmen had to adhere to, and they have done. Give them credit; they have done.
Gosh, I wonder what that makes them feel about being in church, though. I think that's a bit OTT.
Well, that can cut both ways. That can cut both ways because, on the other hand, how many times have we conducted weddings or baptisms or funerals even where people have gone, "Oh, am I allowed in church? Do I need to cover my tattoos? Do I, is it okay to come to church in jeans?" And you go, "Yes, it's fine to come into church with jeans. It's okay."
Yeah, I know.
Don't struck by a thunderbolt.
I often say when I've been at a baptism service, leading a baptism service, and it's such a joyful time, and then you look at the congregation, and they're obviously very excited, but they sit into church and they look very stern and serious, and I I say, you are allowed to smile in church. You've got to welcome this little child, and you've got to do it now. And
Jesus was a fat man.
yes, exactly. It's a
Does that
shame.
mean fat men are happier than slim men?
Well, I think I mean I think it was a great title because I remember it all these years later, and I think I talked about it in a sermon years ago, but I think I think it's fat as in generous and glorying in abundance and being lavish and not skimping. And I don't mean just on what you eat, but because I don't think it was just that. I think it's about your spirit and your welcome, and telling people they can't put the radio on in church isn't being fat. We ought to reclaim fat as as a good thing in some.
I have been for the past 40 years. Don't worry.
Well, me too, David. Me too.
Everybody else, though, particularly the doctor regarding my knee for the moment, doesn't think it's a good idea. So there we are. But I mean, a lot of these things we've been talking about, these rules, or what Jesus was talking about, or was referring to, possibly, they were laws, weren't they, within the temple? It was all about, what respect you give to God in what you do.
Yeah.
Do you prepare yourself ready? And we often ask that. I've been involved in church. You're a member of the curate. One of the team vicars there had a rule that 10 minutes before the service starts, all talking had to stop, and you had to sit and reflect and pray, because you were got to prepare yourself for what was going to come. And we've probably all had, we've all made kind of things like, can you make sure your phone is turned off? Which is common sense and perhaps good, but there are all kinds of things, and these food laws were very important to the Jews, weren't they?
Oh,
Part
yeah.
of the Levitical law, and so for Jesus to be talking or even suggesting different, and that's what part of the readings the last few weeks. I mean, last week particularly, how on earth can this man say that we should eat blood and flesh? I think we referred to it a couple of weeks ago, Chris. I think you did in the last Rev chat. We forget that we live in a totally different world and different customs and traditions today. So when you read these stories, it's good, as we're hopefully doing for people, is trying to get to an understanding of why they were there and what was important.
Yeah, completely. And I think, I don't think it's saying that the rules themselves are bad. It's the way that people use them to lord it over others, and to get everything out of perspective, because those rules would have kept people healthy and safe. And like the rule that you talked about, quietening down before prayer, I think that's a really good thing to do, and sometimes we forget to do things like that. But actually, it's when you make the rule some kind of rod to beat other people with, or there's no flexibility. Jesus was always bending the rules. He did eat with the people that were on the margins, and he did probably hang out with those people who swore all the time, but that it's not whether you're doing that, it's whether it affects you and what goes in and what comes out. I think
it comes across really well in this reading as well, because so he's had his little rating of the Pharisees, and then the back end, when he's speaking to the crowd, and he's talking about all the stuff that comes out is the stuff that defiles, and then he lists those sins. Some of those sins are exactly what the Pharisees have just been doing with the disciples, and ticking them off for not washing their hands. Does that come out of envy? Does that come out of pride, lording it over them? Those are the very sins that Jesus is talking about.
Yeah.
I think that if we're not careful, when we make some of these rules, and as they were then, it's all right having them so long as you stick to them and don't use them to, get your way, or to, rules are needed. I guess laws are needed. We know that, otherwise we'd be totally lawless. But it's not good to use them to your advantage over other people.
It brings to mind Paul with his if you go into a house and somebody doesn't eat meat, then you don't eat meat alongside them.
Yeah.
And don't worry about whether it's ritually clean or unclean or what's gone on with the meat. If you don't know about it, then be a good guest. And don't try and say, oh, you're not allowed to eat meat. No, everybody should be a vegetarian or everybody should eat meat. It's not about that. It's about actually helping each other in their relationship with God, so that
love of God, love of neighbour. That's so
that we don't teach human precepts as doctrines. So that we don't take our human precept of I like my meat or I don't like my meat as that becomes a religious doctrine. You're not a Christian if you eat fish. I
often think that's quite a good approach to times of fasting, like Lent, for example. Often if I give something up for Lent, I tend to be I prefer to be a little bit low key about if I'm invited for a meal or something, and rather than I've given up alcohol, I've given up chocolate, some great big kind of dance about it. Actually, I've given it up except when I'm invited out.
Well, I quite like that.
Visiting everywhere.
I'm going to get invited
exactly.
out all the time. Well, okay, I'll have a gin and tonic.
As I've said many times on Rev Chat, and perhaps it brings us to an end, in the words of Monty Python, God sees through that cheap trick. It's no good. He knows what you're up to, Callie. And now you've told us we will keep an eye on it for the coming years.
Oh, no.
Well, dear viewer, I hope some of what we said has been understandable and good. I think this time of year we're kind of lurching towards things, and some of our readings seem to drag on. I was saddened because I did try to encourage my brothers and sisters to look at the alternative reading from James, only because I always like to get the strapline in, of course, that it's a book of straw, because I think we all like that. But there we are. We've talked about food again. And if Jesus was a fat man, then he took after me, and that's all that matters. And I'm pleased that Jesus obviously saw me as a role model. And who knows? We will hopefully see you next week. Wind or no wind, food or no food, fat, slim, or whatever. And we look forward to that. And thank you all very much for joining us yet again. I just wonder what name Harry's going to give to this week's.
Yes.
We will wait and see. Good to see you all.
All right.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.